right. Well, hello out there. My name is Jason. I'm with Church Alive, executive pastor here at Church Alive. And I am so honored and privileged to have our director of New Mexico Dreamcenter with us, Shelley Repp. Shelley, thank you so much for coming in today. We're going to talk about a very, very difficult subject, which is human trafficking and all the association with it. We're going to get into some very nitty-gritty questions. And so I personally have been looking forward to this time with Shelley. And so thank you so much for coming in. I appreciate you spending some time with us and just bringing a general awareness on this subject.
Absolutely. I appreciate the offer. Thank you so much for the invitation. I feel, as you will see throughout this interview, that I am definitely passionate about this issue. And because it's such a hidden one, I think it is really important that that we develop some awareness around that and that our eyes are open to what's happening in our city, what's happening in our state, what's happening in our world.
Sure. Now, obviously, something is driving you, to even be willing to get into the trenches on something that's just so difficult. So, I assume it's probably personal to some degree. Could you give us just a little bit of familiarity with the Dream Center and then what the Dream Center does, and then possibly a little bit about your journey along the way?
Right, absolutely. So the New Mexico Dream Center has two primary programs. We have what's called an aftercare program for survivors of human trafficking, and then we have a drop-in center for homeless youth here in Albuquerque. And the way those programs form, they're very intertwined. People don't automatically always go human trafficking and homeless youth, but what we see in our community is that there's a lot of different aspects that braid those two pieces together. And so for aftercare, let me just define that real quick because people are probably not necessarily going to know what that means.
Sure.
So for us, aftercare is upon identification of a human trafficking victim, we can provide emergency resources, so things like emergency shelter, emergency food, transportation. We can also provide a transitional living program. We provide case management and all of those things to kind of help that that person who is needing to take some big steps into a different type of life, help them take those steps in a way that is client-focused and client-centered and driven by them. And so that's what aftercare looks like. And then drop-in center, because a lot of times people don't know what that is as well. So a drop-in center is a no-strings attached approach to youth who are living on the street. So essentially they're runaways, they've left home because life is intolerable at home for whatever reason, or they're throwaways, which means they have been kicked out of their home. So they don't have a home to go back to. And in Albuquerque, across the state, we are essentially a resource desert for this population of kids. There are 2 youth shelters in Albuquerque, less than 75 beds between them, but the estimate of the number of homeless kids homeless teens, unaccompanied, within Albuquerque is between 5,000 and 6,000 in a given year. So we have a huge population here that it's not being addressed. And so at the drop-in center, they can come in, they get hot food, they can get food to take with them, that's easy prep, they can take showers, they can do their laundry, they can connect with a case manager, they can work on the computer. So we offer all these different kinds of services. And the most important piece is we want to be able to allow them to develop and create relationships, what we would call transformational relationships with caring adults who can help them make those important steps back into a home or back into services or into adulthood. So those are the two things.
Well, and I have to say I've been to the facility, to New Mexico Dream Center. Shelley was kind enough to give us a tour, and I have to say you have made the best of what you have and the resources available. You can see the care and the level of love at the facility.
Thank
you. If you ever get a chance to check it out, and you'll find that Shelley is putting in her passion and her care. But on a more personal level,
sure.
How does this
Yeah.
Tell us about your journey.
This is crazy, right? So I've been a professional Christian for many, many years. And so what that means was I've actually worked on 2 church staffs here in Albuquerque for 22 years. So I was a children's pastor at a smaller church for 7 years. And then for 15 years, I started in the children's ministry and ran a children's program, and then migrated into community outreach at one of the larger churches in Albuquerque. So I'd been working with kids and families like my whole adult life. And when I was working in community outreach, our church had purchased a building that was kind of closer to the war zone. So if you're a long-term Albuquerque person, you know what we're talking about. And so we had purchased this new building, and I had gone to our senior pastor and said, we've got to do something. Like, God has placed us in this area. Let's do something. And he's like, yeah, go do it. And I'm like, okay, try to figure this out. So one of the first things that we did was we started a kind of a mentoring and tutoring program for seniors in Highland High School that were on the edge of not graduating. Like, they might graduate, they might not. And so we had worked with Highland and had developed this program to help these seniors. And it was primarily, the tutors were primarily UNM students. We had a very large young adult student population. And so we had these younger people working with these high school students. So it was a great mashup. Mm-hmm. And one of those tutors came to me one day, and she's like, Shelley, I need you to talk to the girl I'm working with, because there's stuff going on, and I don't know what to tell her to do. I don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, I've worked with kids and families for so long that I felt very equipped to deal with all of the teen angst. I had 3 daughters myself. I can talk about drama.
Got it all down, huh?
Yeah, I'm like, oh yeah, no, she's broken up with her boyfriend, or she hates her mom, or, just any of these number of things. And so I said, yeah, set it up. And so I'm in my office, and in walks this woman, not a teen girl, but this 20-year-old woman who was a survivor of the genocide from Rwanda.
Oh, my.
And she had, essentially, her parents had been killed in front of her. She had carried her siblings on her back to her grandparents' village, and then her grandparents were killed. And again, siblings on her back to a refugee center on the Uganda border. And then she was able to connect with Catholic Charities. They brought her to Houston, and then, I'm not sure if people realize this, but Albuquerque is a hub for refugees that come into that Houston port. And so, in fact, that's kind of how our international district has formed, is that's where refugees have been placed traditionally. And so that's how that kind of area has formed. So they were able to keep the 3 of them together, found a sponsor family who had come from Africa as well, and placed these 3 kiddos there. Mm-hmm. So things were going well, and she had lost, obviously, a couple years of her life with, that whole genocide issue, and she was getting ready to graduate, so she was doing well in school, hadn't had any problems until second semester. Well, families who sponsor refugees get federal funds, essentially. They get a stipend to help cover costs for these children that they take in. Mm-hmm. So once you graduate high school, that funding for that child is gone. And so there were 3 kids in this family, and so they were going to lose 1/3 of that funding. And this family was, in their eyes, being resourceful. And so they wanted to figure out how they could kind of still have some money. Mm-hmm. And so essentially what they did was they went online and they found a white guy in Detroit who was willing to purchase their sponsor daughter as a bride. And so the family had come to her and they said, so here is your situation. You can leave our home. Once you graduate, you can leave our home and take care of yourself. We're not going to care for you. Or we found this great husband for you who lives in Detroit, and he's going to pay us and all this stuff. And she was so stressed about this because she's got these 2 younger siblings that she sacrificed her life for to take care of, and she didn't want to be separated from them. And so she's sitting telling me the story, and I don't know what to do. I'm like, what? I'm pretty sure it's illegal to sell people. Like, I'm pretty sure that's not supposed to happen, but I don't know. Yeah. And we are, my husband and I are very much, we have like the ability and we want to help in the moment. And so we're like, hey, you're not going to have to be homeless. Like, she actually moved in our home with us for a short time while we were figuring this all out. And so we were able to figure it out. And law enforcement talked with the family and essentially explained that, in America, you can't sell people.
Sure.
And so that kind of started me on this journey of investigating human trafficking, because literally I didn't know what it was other than I was a fan of Liam Neeson and had seen the movie Taken. And so that's what I thought it was. Well, what I discovered is that it is, an absolutely horrific crime that happens globally, but actually happens in an incredible way in the United States. After that situation with that gal from Rwanda, two other things happened that showed me what was happening in New Mexico. One was I have a younger sister who was a single mom, had gotten pregnant unexpectedly, and had decided to move to Albuquerque. And she was working at this low-end job, didn't make a lot of money, couldn't really pay her rent, and she didn't want to live with us. I mean, she did initially, but she wanted to be independent, and ended up being lured into one of the strip clubs in Albuquerque. And so she started dancing, doing all of that. And people don't associate that necessarily
Sure.
with human trafficking. But what we saw was this entry into stripping, into a progression that basically led to her being prostituted, trafficked by the manager of that club. And then a friend of mine had been doing foster care for years and years and years, and had wanted to adopt a couple of kiddos, and had adopted these twins. And the mom had had many children. These were number like 6 and 7. All of them were either adopted or in foster care at some level. And so they adopted these twins, and when they kind of got like the Box O disclosure from CYFD, they realized that the mom was a sex worker right on Central. In fact, we ended up, our outreach teams ended up meeting her. We have never disclosed anything, but she was caught in this, and there was no way for her to get out. And so those three things came together, and it was like, kind of a 2x4 from God saying, it's time to change your trajectory. And
Sure.
That's what we did.
Sure. Well, what is exactly the definition of human trafficking? What's the definition of that?
Sure. So we're going to go by what the federal definition for human trafficking is, because that's kind of what we base services on and response on and all of that. And so it is the use of force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person into commercial sex acts, into labor, or services that's against their will. So that's the definition for an adult, somebody who's over 18.
Okay.
For a minor, it's different. So essentially, for a minor, it's still that compulsion into sex acts or labor or services, but you don't have to show force, fraud, or coercion. So essentially, It's taking a vulnerable young person and forcing them to do something that would be against their will.
Is human trafficking in the U.S. primarily immigration based, or?
So a lot of people think that, a lot of people do, because they look at the global aspect of human trafficking, and every nation has human trafficking in it across the world. Like there's nobody that's exempt from it, and it looks different kind of everywhere. So human trafficking can look like child soldiers. Human trafficking can look like children who their parents have sold them into trafficking, like in India. So it can look really, really different. But it is a huge industry in the United States. And there are immigrants that are trafficked into the United States, but the number of domestic, so people who are from and live in the United States, of trafficking victims is much higher than what the immigrant trafficking victims are. And so to look at a couple of like national numbers around that, in 2018 were the last statistics I saw. And so the estimate was that there were like 23, it's a hidden crime, so it's really hard to put numbers
Sure,
on it.
right.
So it was like 23 to 38,000 immigrants who were being trafficked or were trafficked into the United States at some level. But the number of people who were domestic victims of trafficking were between 600 and 800,000 people. This is a huge number. So yes, it's happening here. And New Mexico as a border state, we know that that's happening within our state.
Sure.
But the majority of our clients were all born in the United States.
Wow. Well, what does it look like in New Mexico?
So in New Mexico, we have a couple of hot spots for trafficking. So our hot spots are, close to Las Cruces, right there by El Paso with that entry point. So we know that we see labor trafficking there, we see sex trafficking there. There's a lot of identification of trafficking right there. So that would be considered a hot spot. Mm-hmm. We have another hot spot on our shared border with Texas where that oil basin is. So Carlsbad, New Mexico. So when we're looking over there, what's happened is that there's this development of man camps because they need labor for the oil fields. And so traffickers, by their very nature, are entrepreneurial. And so we have traffickers who will have like an RV, and he's got the trafficking victim, the girl in that RV. They drive into the oil fields. They set up all these dates, and then if they hear law enforcement's coming or anything like that, they just simply drive away. So we see trafficking happening right there, and then we actually see Albuquerque as a hot spot for trafficking. We're the largest population center in the state by a very large margin, and we've got I-40, I-25 that intersect. We've got, poverty in our city. We've got all these things that kind of add up to a big trafficking hotspot within our city limits.
Wow. So why does New Mexico seem to be an easier state than some of our surrounding states?
Sure. I'm so glad you asked that question, especially because I know you have been talking with people who are going to be running for office and all of that. And it comes down to New Mexico has very weak legislation around the prosecution of traffickers. And so when we look at that, we had passed last year, finally, after years of trying, a piece of legislation that now says you can't prosecute a child as a prostitute. So before, you could have a kid who is a prostitute in the eyes of the law who is obviously being trafficked, and they would be, prosecuted as a criminal. And that just turned over. Before that, it was 2008 when the only legislation was passed. And so our penalty pieces to this are very, very low compared to our surrounding states, and because of that, it's easier to traffic somebody here. There's not as big of an issue if they end up getting caught. Sure. And that's something that we feel needs to be addressed. And so we're part of the New Mexico Human Trafficking Task Force, and the task force put together some legislation that they kind of had to try to get through this 30-day session we had this year, and it passed unanimously, Jason, in the House, and got stalled in the Senate, and they wouldn't hear it, and it wasn't voted on. And so it's like dead in the water, because then we're thinking there's going to be a special session in July. Let's hear it. With the kind of economic state that we're in now in New Mexico and some of those things, we don't anticipate that it's going to be heard. So we'll look at 2021 to be able to try to forward this legislation. But here's the thing. If you're just on state charges as a trafficker, somebody who is selling a person for sex, you get 3 years. So they always try to tack on charges and take it federal, because at the federal level, the penalties are much higher. But New Mexico is weak in this. We have not done a good job at providing awareness around this. And so we essentially have a low grade compared to our surrounding states when you look at the evaluation tools that they use for the United States.
How does a teenager become a human trafficking victim?
Yeah, so here's the thing that people need to understand, is that the average age of entry into human trafficking is quoted as 12 to 14 years old. Those are middle school and young high schoolers. Sure. So when you look at something like that, there are obviously adults who become trafficking victims, but the majority of that entry are these teen years. And I don't know if you remember when you were a middle schooler, that was a difficult time.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
I had 3 daughters, and we just referred to the middle school years as the dark years.
Sure.
We were just glad to survive it.
Right.
But essentially, there are vulnerabilities that are built up or are created in the life of a teenager that these traffickers are willing to exploit. And so when you've got a kid that has instability in their life, that is a vulnerability. So then you've got a kid who maybe has poverty or lower income, and that creates another vulnerability. You've got a kid who has been sexually abused. That creates a vulnerability. So all of these things are called like an ACE score. Have you heard of the ACE
No,
score?
haven't.
So ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. So the more things that happen to you as a child, the higher your ACE score. So you, if your parents are divorced, then you get like a point for that, so to speak.
Sure.
If you're in foster care, any of these things add up to this score. The higher score you have as a child in this ACE kind of evaluation method, the bigger your vulnerability is. So when you're vulnerable and you don't feel like you've got security or anything like that, that is a great field for a trafficker to come in and be the solution to what your perceived problems are. Oh, you have to live with your grandma and she doesn't understand. She doesn't give you a cell phone. I'll give you a cell phone.
Sure.
Oh, you don't have the money for this. Oh, I can do that for you. So essentially what happens is you've got a victim and you've got a hero who's going to come in, and then that hero starts what's called the grooming process that takes that kid from wherever they are into a situation where they feel indebted to, they feel in love with, and they will do what they need to do to maintain that relationship with that trafficker. It's insidious. It's horrific. It's terrible.
Oh, it's amazing. By the way, we are live streaming, so I want to also extend the invitation. We are on Vimeo on our website at churchaliveabq.com. You can go onto our YouTube at Church Alive ABQ, onto our chat, and feel free to ask a question there. We also have Facebook Live. So any of those three outlets, if you're watching and you have a particular question for Shelley, at the end of my questions, feel free to throw it in the chat, and I'll see if I can echo that for you. Shelley, what are some common vocabulary words that we see in trafficking?
Sure. I think these are good things for people to be aware of, because if you hear these words, you should have some action.
Okay.
So especially if they're coming from the mouths of a child. So essentially a young person who refers to their boyfriend as like daddy is a really big red flag. That's
Okay.
a warning sign. Like no teenage girl should ever refer to her boyfriend as daddy.
Sure.
So that's something to be aware of. With somebody talking about the word hustle. Oh, well, I've got to go hustle. I've got to go hustle. I've got to get on my hustle. Hustle is another key word. In fact, there was a 7-year-old girl in Albuquerque who was identified by her school teacher because she kept using this word hustle. She kept talking about hustle. And there were other factors as well, but that was a word where she's like, what is a 7-year-old talking
Sure.
about with something like that?
Right.
If somebody's talking about their folk, that they have to go with their folk, that's another kind of term that is used around human trafficking. So those would be some of those kinds of words to listen to that aren't within the common vernacular of a teenager or a child. So that would be a couple of things to listen to. There's a lot of other phrases that I think people need to be aware of. So referring to a John is a person who is buying sex. So that would be something. A pimp, like that's one of my hot button words because the word pimp has been really kind of glorified in the media. So it's
Sure.
like, you're going to pimp my ride. I'm going to pimp my house. A pimp is a trafficker. A pimp is a person who controls this other person and takes their money away and
Sure.
abuses them. So so people need to be aware. And I don't think that we should glorify
Glorify
that. I disagree with it. So
Right.
those are some of the kind of common things we hear or see around a trafficking situation.
Okay. I'm sure several would be asking the question, how do I keep my children safe in this process?
Yeah. So there's a misperception in the United States especially that kidnapping equals human trafficking. So I've had many a person say, "Oh, I was walking around Kohl's and this guy was stalking. He was gonna lure my daughter into trafficking or something. And it never happens like that. Like if your kid gets kidnapped, I mean, that sounds really horrific. Chances are they're gonna die if they're not found. Like just because they're kidnapped doesn't mean they're trafficked. Just because they're trafficked doesn't mean they're kidnapped.
Okay.
So we need to understand that. We need to understand that traffickers use social media. They use the internet. They use apps on social media as their primary way to contact and to develop relationships with these children, with our children. And we have to be very aware of that. So the first thing that I'd say, just like common sense, is talk to your kids about social media and be very wary and aware of what you allow your kids to have as far as social media goes. We see traffickers working through Instagram, through Facebook. Snapchat is a huge, huge, huge piece of that. Any of the texting apps that's out there, like WhatsApp, any of those, GroupMe, any of those things are all pieces that traffickers are going to use and exploit to be able to get to your children. There's this amazing video out put on by this organization called Bark, which is kind of a protective agency for social media, for parents who want, protective measures for social media.
Sure.
And they put together this video of one of their staff members went undercover and portrayed herself as like a 13-year-old girl. And when she launched her profile, it was within 90 seconds that she was getting requests for like nude pics and, hey, you want to meet up? And, hey, do you want to see this? And, all of these kinds of things.
Wow.
90 seconds. If you don't think your kids haven't been exposed to that, if they have a social media profile, then I'm going to tell you right now that they have. So a couple things I would say, practical things. Obviously, know what your kids are doing. Install parental controls on everything in your house, on your smart TV, on your phone, on your computer, on your kid's phone. All of those things. A couple that are super good that I think are great are Bark, because it will alert to words, it will alert to pictures. I mean, it will give reports to parents immediately. Safe Lagoon is another one that is really, really great. Those are two that I think are great. Another one called Our Pact. All three of those are good tools that I've used personally. The other thing that I would say is never give your kid an iPhone. Now, I have an iPhone.
Sure.
I love my iPhone. I am also maybe 50 years old. And I can responsibly use an iPhone. iPhones are tough nuts to crack.
Sure.
And so any information that comes from an iPhone is old information. Get your kid an Android phone. Get them a Samsung. Get them something like that, because all of those apps, all of those things I told you about, can give instant reports when they see something. When they when they find that word or that phrase or that picture that's dangerous, that parent can get an immediate notification on their phone or on their computer or on their email when that happens. With an iPhone, it doesn't happen till days later, if it ever happens. So if your kid has an iPhone, you've essentially given them a tool that is almost untraceable, unless they're going to let you look at it. And that's, I don't know how likely that is. So parents, your kids have iPhones, go, today is your lucky day. We're going to upgrade your phone. Look at this new Samsung, and get them a new phone, because they can be tracked and iPhones can't. So little simple thing.
What do you do if you think that somebody is being trafficked? I mean, this is such a hard, slippery slope.
Right.
It's uncomfortable, but you start getting these doubts in your mind. What do you do?
So, first of all, I would just want to say that some of our best cases, best clients that have come to us have come through citizens who have been aware that something was going on. That something didn't look right. So I am a big believer in, if it looks suspicious, it is suspicious, especially if it looks suspicious over time. We had this little old lady who had an apartment, and her kind of next door neighbor, I don't even know if she was the next door neighbor, but she knew that there was this girl that lived in that apartment. That girl never left. She never saw her leave that apartment. And there were always different men going in that apartment. There were a few guys that were always there, or seemed to be, but then there's just this trail of men. And she didn't know what it was, but she thought, that is suspicious. it was a girl that had was being trafficked essentially by a gang, and it was happening in that apartment. So what she did, which is what I would say you should do, is if you feel like there's somebody being trafficked, call 911 and say the word trafficking. Say, I think that this is happening. I think this person is being trafficked. And they'll ask you more questions. I think they're being trafficked because they never are allowed out of their apartment.
Sure.
I see, drug paraphernalia, anything like that. So if you see something suspicious, then call the authorities. And even if the authorities don't do something, because we know right now APD, there's a lot of things happening, and APD might not get out there today. But what you're doing is you're creating a trail, because maybe you've said something, and then maybe somebody else has said something.
Sure.
And sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but start creating that trail. Don't think you're just being a nosy neighbor. Start creating that trail, because it literally could save somebody's life. Wow. People are allowed, like they can contact us. They can go on our website. We've got an office phone. We field a fair amount of calls where people are like, hey, so I think this and this and this is happening. We're not a rescue agency. Like, we're not equipped to kick down doors and go pull girls out of situations. We feel like law enforcement should probably do that. But we can definitely talk about what are red flags, what are some of the common signs to be aware of. And we do a lot of training around that. We do training for youth groups, community groups, around what kinds of things to look for.
Wow. Why is this issue so quiet? I mean, it just seems like it's such a hidden, unknown issue. I know my past, until I really started diving into it. I knew that trafficking was taking place, but I just kind of assumed, well, it's someplace on the other side of the Pacific.
Sure.
So there's just a lot of assumptions about the reality of this, and it just seems to be so quiet. Why is it such a hidden issue?
So it's a criminal enterprise, and all criminal enterprises are going to be hush-hush if at all possible, right? Mm-hmm. But this has another layer to it. So if you are buying and selling drugs, you are buying drugs from somebody else who's in this industry, and you're selling to somebody who's in that industry. So it's a little easier to kind of keep undercover.
Sure.
When you're buying and selling people, then you are you're bringing in outside sources who don't want to be known that they're purchasing somebody for sex. I mean, you think about it, I know we'll probably talk about, or if you want to, I'm happy with it, like Jeffrey Epstein and all of these things, high profile people buying children for sex. And so the buyer is going to be very hush-hush about that, because, he might have a family, he might have a good job. He doesn't want to be known for something like that. So it's in his benefit to be quiet about it.
Sure.
It's absolutely in the benefit of the trafficker to be quiet about it. It's to the benefit of the person who's being trafficked to be quiet about it. So the thing is, it is a hard nut to crack, because everybody is in on the secret, even though the secret's kind of out in the open. Mm-hmm. When you are able to start recognizing it in your community, it is the easiest thing to see. Like, we see it happen all the time. You talked about our facility and how you'd come to our facility, and we're off of East Central, and so that's kind of a sketchy area. Sure. I love it. I love being in a sketchy area. Yes. But we see all of those things easily outside our door. Like, we can see that happen. And so it's secret because it's to the benefit of everybody. The guy who's making the money, the guy who's paying the money, the girl that's in there and doesn't know what to do. She might be arrested because in her mind she's a prostitute, so she's the one that's going to be in trouble. So that's how you keep it a secret for years and years and years.
Wow. Public awareness. How do we wake our communities up?
Oh, let's wake them up. Let's redefine some things. Boy, I remember, Jason, and I don't know if with your spiritual journey, if you had that, but I remember having the thoughts of, like, that person, and hearing people like, oh, that loose woman, or blah, 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 all of those things. And so my own bias made me blind to something like that. So this is what I think believers across Albuquerque, across New Mexico, across the United States, across the world need to realize that the things that we call sin, that we look at and we say, this is sin, that there are behind the scenes factors that go into that. And let's look at that, because what we're saying is, oh, that's a prostitute and that's the world's oldest profession and she does that because she's an addict, or she does that because she's a nympho. Sorry.
Sure.
She does that because, without realizing that the guy on the corner who's watching her is making sure she's standing out there. So we have to be open to having kind of uncomfortable conversations around sex and around those issues. I think we need to understand that there is supply and demand, right?
Sure.
So if there's no demand for purchasing sex, specifically purchasing sex from children, then there's no supply. And so there's demand. So how's this demand increasing? Why do we have so much demand? Is demand, more now than it was 20 years ago? And I would say it absolutely is. And that ties back to pornography. And that ties back to some really big issues with men that have gone unconfronted and uneducated for ever.
Sure.
So I think we have to kind of look at some of those things, because it's taking us from pointing our finger saying sinner to me. What would be my piece to this?
Sure.
And honestly, like when we do the stats of who are the buyers of these women and of these children, the breakdown's pretty scary, because the breakdown for that is 78% are white males of the people who are buying sex out there. And then after white males, it comes to African American males, and then it goes to Hispanic males, and then there's this tiny fraction, it's like 3%, that are Asian males.
Wow.
Women aren't buyers. So this whole kind of concept of women buying sex from like guys is pretty much non-existent. There are many human trafficking victims that are male. It's other males who are buying them. And so, so looking at that, that's confronting some pretty deep rooted and secret sin issues in our lives
Sure.
as a society.
Right.
And so to become aware, we have to really confront some ugly truths.
Sure. America has a rich history of great accomplishments, and then it also has a great history of tremendous injustice.
Yeah.
Like what we're just talking about now. We're right in the middle of a tremendous injustice with George Floyd and everything there. When we talk about injustice against humanity, we can go in a lot of different places. So I don't want to be insensitive.
Okay.
Yes, insensitive to those issues, because especially with the moment at hand. But when you place human trafficking in a tier, at what tier would you place human trafficking when it comes to an injustice against humanity?
So I would place it as a top tier injustice. And the reason why is because, again, when you look at things like racism, this is systemic. It is systemic. For the history of people on Earth, there have been vulnerable people who have been used as slaves, and essentially human trafficking is modern day slavery. Mm-hmm. And as we look at that, you've got a group of people who are willing to care so little about another group of people that they will use whatever means to get their ends and their financial gain from that.
Sure.
And so in looking at that, I would put it as a top tier human rights issue and injustice. And then I think because for so long people have looked at the victim of human trafficking as the criminal, that levels that injustice up again. Because then you look at like the victim of racism, and there is no doubt, I don't think anybody can look at what happened to George Floyd and say that he was anything but a victim.
Sure.
Whatever you believe about anything, he was a victim. But when people look at a human trafficking victim, specifically a sex trafficking victim, that's a mind switch to go from oh, a prostitute, they're doing that by choice and blah, 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 to they're coerced, they're forced, they're there through fraudulent means. And so so then we've got that level of injustice that happens. And so that's really where I think we are, is I think we look at being that top tier injustice, and how are we going to confront the biases and the stigma that goes with that, and how are we going to have an answer and a reply? Because Rahab, the famous prostitute from the Bible, is in the lineage of Jesus.
Sure.
It's time we started a different conversation around that.
Sure. So on a little bit bigger scale than just New Mexico,
Sure.
I know you talked about social media and some of the enticements relative to just focusing on young teenagers, but
Right.
are there other avenues? How do these handlers get these children? Are there other avenues that they?
So there's, like I said, social media right now is the biggest recruitment area, and we have to look at it as recruitment. Like I said, it's not generally just a one-off where somebody walks by and kidnaps the child. It can happen, but it's just not as likely. So traffickers are, as I said before, they are entrepreneurial. And they're predatory. So they are looking for vulnerable populations. So where can they find vulnerable populations? And this is where our homeless youth tie into this specifically, is that if there's a need and the trafficker can identify that need and that vulnerability, then they can exploit it. So we have a huge amount of runaway and homeless youth. And this is basically a hunting ground for the traffickers in New Mexico. So here's the deal. Those kids, they don't have a place to sleep. So there's this, worry, this concern, this vulnerability about, where am I going to put my head down tonight? Like, if I'm sleeping in the park, is somebody going to attack me? What am I going to do? So they're afraid.
Sure.
They're homeless. They don't have a source of income for things like food. So where am I going to get some food? How am I going to do that? How am I going to stay clean? Like, I want to take a shower. How am I going to stay clean? How am I going to take care of, I need to change clothes, all of these things. So essentially what happens when you become a homeless kid, you have barriers to try to access those things as an adult. So Jason, I don't want this to happen to you, my friend. But if you became homeless, there is a spectrum of services that could be there to help you. Like, you can get housing because you're old enough to get it, right? You're over 18. You've got your driver's license. You've got a form of ID. You can get food stamps because of your age. These things aren't available for our kids. Kids can't get food stamps by themselves. They can't check themselves into a hotel or motel even if they had money. Most of the kids we see don't have driver's licenses. If they did, they were stolen from them. And so this population is a hunting ground for traffickers, because then the trafficker can go in and say, hey, come with me. Come with me. I don't know how long this is supposed to be, but can I tell a quick story?
Yeah, you go for it.
Okay,
Go for
so I
it.
want
Go
to tell
for
a
it.
story of one of our clients who's an adult, but how she ended up within 24 hours becoming a trafficking victim.
Wow.
So she'd had a lot of trouble. Mom and dad were divorced. Dad had started using drugs, and so he was really out of the picture. Mom had a lot of financial worries because, again, dual income, now single income. What's she going to do?
Sure.
She had 2 kids. She had the older daughter and then this younger daughter, and her older daughter was causing all sorts of trouble at school and driving her crazy. And the older daughter was, not coming home on time and acting rebellious and all of that. And so she finally was fed up, and she said, you're out of here. You're gone. She gave her backpack. She gave her wallet that had $23 in it. And she said, this is tough love. You've got to figure out this yourself. You can't come back here. And so our girl left. And so she kind of wandered around Albuquerque. She was, a smart kid. She had a smartphone, so she looked up and she found a youth shelter. And so she walked herself over to the youth shelter, and she was able to hang out for a while. But CYFD had basically a regulation that for you to access shelter services, you have to be signed into that shelter by a parent or a guardian or you have to be like a ward of the state. CYFD signs you in. And so so they said, hey, we have to have your mom sign you in. So she tried calling her mom, and her mom answered and said, I told you, you had to figure it out yourself. Don't call me again. And she hung up. And so our girl walked away. And she walked away, and she ended up on, I think, the hunting grounds in Albuquerque, which is Wyoming and Central. She ended up on Wyoming and Central at that. There's a McDonald's and a gas station there. And so she's standing there and she's trying to figure out, what she can do. So she's trying to, text her friends, can I spend the night at your house? Any of those things. And so this guy, rolls up in a car, he jumps out and he runs over to her and he's like, you look like you have had a bad day. And she's like, yeah, my day sucks. And he's like, hey, you want to go party? And she goes, sure. Maybe she'll know somebody at the party. Maybe she can spend the night at the party. At least minimally she can forget about how miserable her life is for a short time. Sure. So he goes, he opens up the door for her. She slides into the front passenger seat and he runs around and gets in on his side. So she slides in and she reaches over to try to grab her seatbelt. And she notices that the inside of the car door had been tampered with. So there was no handle for her to grab to get out of that car. Oh, wow. And when he slid in on his side, he slid in, he pulled back from his waistband, and he laid a gun on his lap. And she knew she was done. She's like, he's going to kill me. That's what she thought. So he took her to a local motel, brought her into a room, and he said, you need to go take a shower. And so she did. So she went in, she took a shower. When she got out of the shower, he had gone through her backpack and her wallet, and he had her stuff all laid out. And he said, so your name is, and he read off her name, and this is where you used to live, and you looks like you have a mom and a sister, and if you don't want anything to happen to them, you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do. And so he raped her, and he sold her that night. So that is why we can't afford to let our kids be homeless kids on the street. Like, we've got to do a better job, Jason, because this is what they're facing. And there are people out there. We've had 3 clients who were all trafficked from that same corner, all different traffickers. It's a hunting ground. We've got to do better.
Wow.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's an important conversation to have. Going to echo this one more time. If you have any particular questions for Shelley, I've got a few more myself, but at the end of it, I'm going to take a look at social media and see if you have anything specific that you would like to ask her. So now would be a great time to fill that out, sign into chat, ask away. We'll see if we can cover those things. But Shelley, you mentioned this, and so more on a federal level. This is obviously a federal and a global issue as well. We're hearing about networks like Nexium and obviously Jeffrey Epstein that you just mentioned. A lot of chatter in Hollywood. Yep. Is it possible that this monster is much deeper and much broader than we think? And what is it doing to humanity as a whole?
I think your use of the word monster is so perfect, because it is a monster. So, let's talk about that Jeffrey Epstein thing. You've got somebody who was able to accrue millions of dollars. They still haven't really figured out how he's done that. Sure. Other than looking at what he was doing with teenagers in New Mexico here, at Zorro Ranch,
right
even.
On the other side of the mountain.
Yep, exactly, right here. And so I think that this is a huge issue in the United States. I think that we as a people have kind of, people meaning U.S. citizens, have basically unrelenting appetite for whatever it is we want because we live in a prosperous country and what we want is sex. I think that with the innovation of the internet, I think that young kids access pornography earlier and earlier. They're reprogramming their brains by accessing all of that type of stuff. And so we're creating a population that is looking for that next fix in some way. Right. And I think that's what's happening. I think Jeffrey Epstein was a supply and demand guy. Do I think he was? I think he absolutely purchased girls for himself, or didn't purchase, but supplied them, sure, sex slaves for himself. But he saw this as high-end way to meet the needs of very wealthy and famous people. Right. I mean, you look at that stuff and you've got British royalty, you've got
big
presidents,
names.
you've got Hollywood, and same thing with Nexium, same thing in Hollywood. So, so we have to realize that that there's some deep-seated issues that need to be addressed
Sure.
across our nation. The other thing that we have to kind of be awake to, I think, Jason, is that what we see is the trend for trafficking victims becoming younger and younger and younger. And there's some community things we need to understand with that with the buyers. First of all, a younger person for the trafficker is going to bring in much more money than somebody who's older.
Sure.
For the person who's purchasing that child, the chances of them not having diseases is much higher. So it's safer for them. When you investigate things like Pornhub and these different porn sites, what they advertise is, like barely legal, like these young girls. So what we're doing is we're developing a taste as a nation for younger and younger and younger girls. And it's easy to find. You know what? You don't have to order sleazy magazines anymore secretly. You don't have to go to the dirty bookstore to rent or purchase videos or magazines or whatever. You don't have to do that. Nobody has to know. And if nobody has to know, then are there consequences? Not to you necessarily. And so what happens is then you develop that feeling of freedom. What we've learned from studies around men who've bought sex and are trying to not buy sex or, have had to pay legal penalties for this is that it starts with pornography. They become addicted to pornography. That pornography becomes more and more and more graphic, and then what they see on that screen is what they want to enact, and that's why they buy somebody. And so we're creating our own supply and demand through that, and that needs to be addressed. And and I say that because there's maybe somebody in the audience that's like, you know what, my issue is pornography, and I want to address that. I want to take that on as an issue or something like that. There's so many things that need to happen upstream.
Sure.
To
get away from this.
Yeah, to get away from this. Here's the deal. We're there and we're feeling like we're in the muds, pulling them out. But, you got to go upstream, which is why we started working with youth and opened up the drop-in center, is because we felt like that is upstream. If we can prevent them from falling into this, horrific waterfall of chaos, let's do that.
Right.
So.
Wow.
And it's, what's sad to me about that is that, again, it's hard to investigate. People that carry a lot of weight, royalty, presidents, Hollywood, senators, all of these things that in their mind, it's in their best interest that it's not discovered. And so then you have scandal. You have essentially where they're going to try to cover it up all the time instead of anything coming up in the open.
Right. A little bit of positive.
Yay, let's do some positive.
Let's do some positive.
I'm so sorry. I always feel like it's like
when you're in these conversations,
heavy.
It's heavy and hard stuff, and I hope you're watching out there and really getting a lot of this, because these are serious and important conversations to have. But positive side, I've noticed that websites like Backpage completely shut down.
Mm-hmm.
Portions of Craigslist, which they had that little section in there.
Yeah.
Those have been shut down. Which were hotbeds for a lot of this. So it seems like things have changed a little bit over the years, and I'm just curious, on a federal level, what are the numbers?
Sure.
What's been neglected in the process? What's being accomplished now, and what are the challenges moving forward? I know it's a big question, but just where are we in this?
So here's the good and the bad. The good is that, Backpage being shut down was a huge win. Huge win. That was awesome. And, that whole thing started with a mom whose daughter ended up being trafficked as, I think, a 15-year-old. Mom found her on Backpage. And that's where that whole, kind of avalanche of stuff happened. And it took years and years and years for that to happen. So there's been definitely some accountability around that, and which is excellent. We think those are great victories. What we have to realize, though, is that, again, traffickers are entrepreneurial and predatory. So there is always that next thing. So previously, it was like the generation of Craigslist and Backpage was the generation of the desktop or the laptop computer, where your computer sat somewhere. But now your computer's in your hand. And so what we see now are apps that are used for traffickers to sell and for Johns to buy.
They actually have apps for this?
Yeah. Oh,
wow.
Apps, and and things that again you don't realize. So I had mentioned earlier. Be aware with your kids of like the app that's called WhatsApp, and it's WhatsApp. So that's a texting app that operates independently from like your phone texting app, like on your iPhone. It's web based, so Wi-Fi based. I mean, and so you've got traffickers that can communicate like that. That's how we see trafficking happening with truck drivers a lot of the time. So there are a variety of apps that are out there that traffickers then definitely use to buy and sell people on it. So we need to stay vigilant with it is the thing. And and I want to kind of give some props, and then I'm going to give you some numbers. Okay. So props, Anthony Mays, who works for the Attorney General's office. So he leads 2 task forces. He leads the task force, the New Mexico Human Trafficking Task Force, so he's lead law enforcement guy for that. And then he's also lead law enforcement guy for the ICAC unit. And the ICAC unit stands for Internet Crimes Against Children. Okay. And so he has some great resources, again, for parents around those apps, and does some training for parents, and again, like us, schools, churches, parents, he's very passionate about that. Wow. And so we have to go, yay.
Good. Yay.
Craigslist is closed down and Backpage, but don't stop the good fight because it's happening just in other forums. So that's kind of the good and the bad with that. Okay. So again, that being said, going back to some pretty big numbers, is that we are looking at trafficking victims in the hundreds of thousands in the United States. So what I would recommend for people to do who want to do a deep dive on this is our 2 different websites that their job is basically studying these things. So one of them is polarisproject.org, and again, polarisproject.org. They work with the National Human Trafficking resource center, essentially. Sure. And so what they do is they will publish state-by-state reports. They will publish United States reports that will show how many cases. And so I was looking at it before we came, and there were, in 2018, there were 14,800 cases against traffickers across the United States, which represented 298 independent people. So people who had been trafficked were at the 300,000 mark in 2018. So it's pretty big number. Big number. So that would be one. And Polaris Project focuses more on adults. They do have numbers for children, but they're kind of their deep dive again is adults. Excuse me for just a second. I'm so glad I asked for the water.
I'm gonna grab a little water.
Or that you offered it, I should say. I didn't ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then the other website that I would recommend is sharedhope.org. And sharedhope.org focuses specifically on minors. So they are looking at under 18, and they do this amazing thing. So they have this study tool, and they call it Project Innocence. Okay. And it is a state-by-state evaluation of the trafficking picture for each state, and it gives them a grade. So remember how I talked to you before about how legislation in New Mexico is really weak, and we've got a low grade for that. Sure. So for years, we had a D. So New Mexico was a D. This last year, because we passed that one piece of legislation saying you shouldn't, prosecute a minor as a prostitute, that raised it up to now we're like a C minus. So we got out of the Ds. We're a C minus. So Arizona, Utah, Colorado, and Texas, all our surrounding states, are all A's and B's. All. Wow. All A's and B's. And so New Mexico, have a lot of work to do. And the
Sure.
thing is, when we look at population-wise, like New Mexico population-wise is small compared to all of our surrounding states. Like,
Sure.
our whole population in our state is smaller than the greater Houston area, which is a hotbed for trafficking, but they're doing so many things for children. So those would be two websites that I would recommend as deep dives to really get those numbers, and that way you can see them state by state. Our numbers in New Mexico, as reported through the Human Trafficking Task Force for law enforcement, we look at essentially, since the task force has been around since 2016, we've seen almost 100% increase every year and on cases being taken to court, which is different than number of victims served. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at, I think New Mexico was at like 198 cases, prosecutable cases of human trafficking, but we're looking at, within services, like 1,100 human trafficking victims accessing services. So there's kind of that disparity that makes it a little bit hard to count. And we feel like we've just touched the tip of the iceberg because most of us focus on sex trafficking because if you kind of think about it, it's kind of the low-hanging fruit. It's easier to identify. It's easier to find. We are an agricultural state. It is happening, we are sure, across our state. We just haven't been able to necessarily find or have outreach tools for the labor trafficking victims that are out there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, it seems from previous conversations that we had, seems like arrests have been up in the recent years, but the infrastructure to follow suit to help on that side,
Yes.
still a little wanting.
Much.
Can you fill us in a little bit on that?
Yeah. So we have, in New Mexico, when this task force started, they worked really hard on building infrastructure for adults. It's easier to build infrastructure for adults because, as an adult, you can sign in for yourself. Mm-hmm. It's difficult for children. So in 2016, when the task force started, we were able to, I think we had maybe 4 beds in the state for trafficking victims. And so we're up into probably 150 beds, let's say, for the state of New Mexico, which isn't great, but hey, that's better than 4.
Sure.
Right? So we've got a number of beds. Our children still have 0 beds. So here is the reality for children who've been trafficked. So for teens who've been trafficked, there is no safe house for them. So there isn't like a place where they're identified and they're able to access immediate services. There are no resource pathways. So depending on how and when and why they're identified will totally depend on what happens to them. Because there's no dedicated beds for trafficking victims that are children in our state, most of the time they're sent out of state. Foster parents who would be willing to are not trained. They're not trained in how you could care for this kind of high needs kid. We don't have those resource pathways. It's not there. One of the things we really are passionate about and that we want to do, and it's so funny because I was talking with a friend of mine who's a school social worker and is also a clinician beforehand because we want to create pathways. CYFD was given, so this year's 2020, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So in 2018,
I know.
We are halfway through the year.
It's been an odd year.
Yeah, exactly. Redo. So in 2019, CYFD was given $500,000 through the legislature to set up safe house services or what we would call practical, concrete, tangible services, beds. Mm-hmm. A place for them to go, therapists that have been trained in what to do, that type of thing. So they were given $500,000 through the legislature to solve this or do something because they're not doing anything. And then additionally, get this. So BurnCo, so if you're living in, the Albuquerque metro area, if you're living in Bernalillo County,
sure.
We pay a tax. We pay a mental health tax. I don't know if everybody knows that or not, but you pay a tax that's to help support mental health services for people in our county specifically. And that tax money is a big chunk of money. And so the BurnCo County Commissioner essentially they'll send out like an RFP, a request for proposal for agencies to say, hey, give us some of this money because this is a problem and this is how we're going to solve it. Mm-hmm. So CYFD wrote an RFP to Burnco, and Burnco granted them. Burnco is Bernalillo County. Sorry about that. CYFD is Children, Youth, and Families Department, and I say that because some people don't know unless you've had experience. You know, you don't throw that around. So I apologize for that. So Burnco awarded $1 million, right? And that $1 million was for CYFD to locate, renovate, get up to code, whatever they need to do, a building that can be used for safe house, because there's freaking nothing in New Mexico. There's nothing for our children here. Ask me, Shelley, so how's that safe house going?
Shelley, so how's that safe house going?
What safe house? There is no safe house. There is no safe house. And so there still are not services for children. And so our goal is to fill that gap. That's a huge gap. And so our goal is to be able to, we feel like there needs to be a residential facility. So we are in a fundraising campaign, which I was talking to you about. Yep. Raising all the money. And you did, and thank you. He did give us some money, actually.
We'll talk about that.
We feel like there needs to be a residential treatment center, or a residential center of some sort, so that when those kids are identified, there's a place they can immediately go that's safe, that has trained personnel around it. And here's the thing. We're God's people, right? Jesus lives in us.
Right.
We are the solution to this problem. When you look across the nation, Jason, there are faith-based organizations that are addressing human trafficking, and then there are non-faith-based, that are run by the government or run by whatever. The faith-based organizations, by and large, are hitting it out of the park, out of the park in providing services and innovation and generosity. And it's because Jesus is our healer, right?
Right.
He's actually God, and if we believe he's God, then he's going to be the lasting solution. The agencies that are not faith-based haven't been producing life change like what we've seen because there's not God in there, and it makes a difference. This is, for us as believers, this is our issue. We need to care for our children. The Bible's very clear about orphans. These are orphans.
Right.
And we need to step in and be willing to walk that challenging road, because let me just tell you, people think, I want to go save a human trafficking victim. It's not easy.
No,
They're a little bit rough.
I can imagine.
But this is what we can do, and we should. So to tell you the truth, I am not surprised that CYFD hasn't done that. Well, I'm a little surprised because that's a lot of money to not do anything with, but,
right.
But I think part of it is because we're supposed to, and not just me as Dreamcenter, but you as Church Alive, and you as who's watching out there, we as God's people, God's representatives here on earth. This is our mission. This is what we need to do.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, you answered my next question. I had actually.
Sorry.
Tell me about the New Mexico Dream Center and the goals moving forward. I think
yes.
you covered that pretty well. Being in ministry myself, I can attest to some of just the struggles of ministry. But on occasion, there's that story that just brings you back. You reflect on it. You experience it. And it's one of those moments that you're just because of this moment, all the blood and the sweat and the tears and the effort and the energy, it's all worth it. Is there a story along your journey that, obviously without naming names,
but, absolutely.
Is there a story that's impacted you in that way?
Yeah. So, the stories around human trafficking are tough because, they always start out so rough, and there's things that you just couldn't believe could ever happen in a family or to a child, and they happen.
Right.
And again, I keep focusing on the kids because that's where we're planting our flag, is with the children. But so we had a gal who came to us as an adult client, and she didn't come. So usually we get referrals from law enforcement or other social service agencies. And she came to us as a referral from a home care thing. So, taking care of seniors in their home, one of those agencies. Mm-hmm. And so what it was this employee that had kind of had a breakdown and had started talking with her boss about some things that had happened in her life. And she know how to deal with them and all of that. And so her boss was former law enforcement and had some human trafficking training. And she was like, oh my word, this is human trafficking. So she helped her make the call to us, had literally just looked us up online. We didn't have any association with this, agency at all. And so this gal came, and she had been trafficked since she was 9 years old. So her father sold her. So essentially she grew up in a family that this was kind of part of the family history. And so starting at 9 years old, he started selling her, and he would take her to where, different places, and in the back of his pickup truck would sell her to people. And then it continued her whole life. So it started at 9. He trafficked her all across the United States, definitely into her adult years. And then she ran away in Albuquerque as an adult. She ran away, and he wasn't really able to locate her, and ended up kind of leaving New Mexico and all of that. So she had run away, and she was at a women's shelter, and the women's shelter helped her get like an ID and all that stuff. And she just kind of then started working because she didn't have income. And so she's like, I have to take care of myself.
Sure.
And so she was working, and then just kind of had this mental breakdown. So she came in, and she came into our housing, because our housing is free. We don't want you to feel like you have to work a job when you need to get healed. And so she came, and she stayed, and started the process, going through all of that. And she was a tough client because she'd been doing this for so long. And it's so easy when you're entrenched in this, and if you feel like you need money, it's just easy to go, oh, well, I can go do this or that. And so we worked with her. She started going to, a local church that was just really supportive of her. Like, she never revealed to them, I don't think they know that she is a trafficking survivor, but they just connected with her. And it was, it was a medium-sized church that had a really strong, like, home group, like community groups. Churches all call them different things.
Sure.
And so she was able to connect, and these people in this community group just wrapped around her, and they just loved her. And so fast forward today, she lives in her own apartment. She pays her own bills. She's not, on, assistance or any of those kinds of things. She drives her own car. She has her own cats, and so she lives this life that we would look at and go, and and her apartment's small, and her car's old, and her furniture's used, but it's hers, and it's hers, and she finally has a place that she can really call home, and it is her home. And so, and to me, that's the thing that's beautiful. Oh, and get this, she'd had a daughter when she was young, when she was 20 or something like that, and she had tried to keep the baby, just didn't feel, she was so worried that this little girl would end up being trafficked because she had been trafficked. And so she, gave that baby up for adoption and didn't think she would ever see her again. Well, her little girl graduated high school this year. She was able to reconcile with her. I mean, not she doesn't live with her, but
Sure.
And so there's this beautiful thing that we see, and those things, that those trappings of life that we take for granted, she finally has for the first time.
Yeah,
it's a really
absolutely.
beautiful story.
So if somebody wanted to jump in the trenches with you, I mean, obviously there was probably a little bit of a vetting process, but is that even possible? And if so, how would one take a step?
Yeah. So here is the thing. We are a small organization that does big stuff. Literally, there are only 5 paid staff members, and only 2 of them are full-time, with me being one. We are like 95% volunteer run. Like, this is how we run our programs, is through volunteers. Our case managers, who work side by side with our human trafficking clients, are volunteers. Our staff at our drop-in center are volunteers. All of the food that we give away is voluntarily given. So we actually have tons of volunteer opportunities. Everything from, so before I came today, we had a gal that was there that comes once a week, and she cleans our bathrooms for us. So everything that in a normal business you pay people to do, our volunteers do. And so so you have everything from helping clean at the harbor, to doing drives for us, like if we need food or if we need hygiene, to working side by side with somebody, to helping with data entry kinds of things. So, so we have a ton of volunteer opportunities for people who are interested. We feel like it's really important that somebody, before they decide they want to kind of jump in this, that they definitely pray about it, that they talk to their family about the kind of ministry they're going to be doing, even if it's like, I'm just going to come and mop the floors,
Sure.
something like that. Because, first of all, our place is really safe. We haven't had any violence there or anything like that. We are on East Central, so sometimes that frightens people. But, you need to pray, and your family, your support needs to wrap around you and pray, because I'm a big believer. I've seen it too many times that you decide to jump in and say, yes, this is what I'm going to do. And you have this target on your back all of a sudden
Sure.
that you never realized you had. And
You
then
weren't
your
prepared for the
life
fight.
falls apart.
Right.
So I would say definitely pray and make sure. But then we have, you can go onto our website, click on the little menu bars, and there's this area that says get involved. And so you click on that, and it's just kind of an interest form. And so essentially you fill out a little form, goes to our admin, who then sends you information on what it means to get involved. Because depending on what you want is going to depend on the amount of training that you do. Like, I'm not too worried about you having a whole ton of training if you're going to come mop my floors for me. I have a real concern if you want to come and work side by side with somebody that
Sure.
you have, the level of training that you would get from any agency. So there's a lot of training that goes into it,
Right.
depending on kind of what your volunteer capacity is.
Right. Should we check chat? See if anyone
Yeah,
has
let's see
any
if anybody said anything. I have no idea.
Let's take a peek here.
And if it's not, that's okay.
Yeah, well, we'll find out here. And then I will have one question myself, one final question
Okay.
when we're done here. But then I also want to kind of share a little bit of our partnership with you. Let's see.
Look at that. You are doing all the different tasks.
Yeah, we're dancing. We're dancing. I think we are good.
Okay.
Let's see. Yeah, I think we're good. Okay, so for those of you who are part of Church Alive and the Church Alive family, as you know, every November we enter into a community impact fund, an end of the year offering for specific ministries and a specific evangelism. This was our heart going into this year, that we would engage in initiatives to help in subjects like human trafficking. We had to take a little bit of a pause with the COVID, because we needed to see how the COVID issue was going to play out. So we're still in that place to some degree with the Community Impact Fund, but one area that we knew specifically we needed to make sure to support, at least from a start standpoint, is the New Mexico Dreamcenter. So part of the Community Impact Fund, we did contribute to Shelley and to the New
Thank
Mexico
you.
Dreamcenter.
We appreciate it. We
And we appreciate.
makes such a difference.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that contribution is from the Community Impact Fund. I'm believing that it's just a start. We need to
Aw,
kind of let
thank
this play out and make sure that other areas of benevolence or
Cared for.
unforeseen variables that we're now in right now are cared for.
Absolutely.
Hopefully we can add to that as we go on. But Church Alive.
Thank you. Thank you. We really appreciate it because, again, Jason, like when I talked about it earlier with us only having 5 staff members, like that is the reality. And from even working at a church that volunteers are the heart of what makes it work.
Sure.
And
Absolutely.
the fact is that without those kind of donations, like I'm just telling you, God took care of us with that type of thing that came unexpected, because we hadn't talked in a while, and
Yeah,
so
it's been a
then
few
you're
months.
like blowing up my phone. I'm like, what is going on?
I know.
And the thing is that it came at the right time, and that's what God does, is He knows what our needs are. And for us, sitting there going, okay, So survival this month is going to be interesting,
Sure.
and I know all of us, with COVID, it's been kind of unsure. But thank you. It makes a difference. And in behalf of the children that we serve and the survivors that we serve, thank you. It really does. It really makes a difference. Thank you.
Absolutely. And, it is ministries like yours that unfortunately in circumstances like this, they kind of just get forgotten about a little bit.
It can
it's
happen.
just natural tendency.
Yeah. Yep. It does.
So I have one final question for you. How can we be in prayer for you, for the Dreamcenter? How can we be an additional support to you along the way?
Sure.
Are there specific things that we can be praying about
Yes.
to come alongside and partner with you?
Yes, absolutely. So I would say we always appreciate prayers for protection for our outreach staff, because we do, outreach is literally people with backpacks on their back going out into the scary streets of Albuquerque.
Sure.
To talk with people and to interact. We had, like I said before, we've never had anything bad happen. We did have somebody throw eggs at us one time, but
I'll take that.
I'll take eggs over bullets,
Right.
But so we've never actually had anything happen really. And I think part of that is because of consistent prayer for protection. So I would ask, when you think of New Mexico Dream Center and understanding that really we are walking those dark places, that there would be prayer for that. Okay. I would also pray that there would be prayer for opportunities. And so not only just opportunities with the people that we're talking with, but opportunities with other churches, opportunities with other agencies, with law enforcement, kind of a cool thing. We don't know if it's going to really happen or not, but the Attorney General's office has talked with us, and they're writing for a grant to be able to kind of secure resource pathways for children who've been trafficked. They're writing for this money, and essentially they came to us and they said, if we get this grant, what we would like to do is we'd like to work with you guys. We would like you to, X and, lay out all these different things.
Sure.
And, what an honor and a privilege for the worldly things to come to the people of faith to say, can you solve this problem?
Sure.
Because then I'm like, yes, we want to solve that problem. And so praying for those kinds of opportunities. And then the final one, which is this really tangible one, is we need to get a facility. We need to have a safe facility where these kids can go and start their journey of healing and recovery. And we're pretty specific. We feel like it should not be right inside Albuquerque. Right. We've got a bus system. There's, shouldn't be in Albuquerque. So we think maybe East Mountains, but maybe Valencia County or something, but something that's a little bit more rural, something
Sure.
that's not quite in the heart. We feel like we need to have at least a minimum of 10 beds in some way, shape, or form. There has to be security around it. We need fences and cameras. So those are the kinds of things that we look at with this facility, is that something that is going to be a safe place for our kids. Our goal, this year again, is that, raising funds for a down payment and making sure that we've got, money in the bank, so to speak, to be able to pay mortgage, staffing, all of those kinds of things. Our hope is that in 2021 that we're opening it up, these last 6 months, because, my plan was to do my fundraising campaign starting in March, and that didn't happen.
I understand that.
So we're a few months behind. So starting in June, but with that, and maybe there's somebody out in your audience even that's like, hey, well, we have a piece of property that needs to be, X, or they know somebody or whatever, but to pray about that. I don't know what that answer exactly looks like.
Sure.
But the children of our state need that. And what an excellent opportunity to show the grace and the love and the mercy and the justice, the heart of God to these kids in that kind of immersive residential kind of atmosphere.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, Shelley, thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yes.
I hope this brought a little bit of awareness in just a subject that's just dark and it's hard and it's easy to put your head in the sand and say it doesn't exist, and it's easy to put these issues on the shelf. But when we talk about an importance in humanity, I can't imagine any higher. There's certainly lots of high issues, but this is up there with them. And so
I agree.
I appreciate you spending that
Thank
time with us,
you.
and it's been an honor and a privilege to to just sit down and talk about these
Yeah.
things. So
Thanks for having me. I appreciate that.
absolutely. Blessings, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.